You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
This podcast is brought to you by Carvana. Got a car to sell but no time to waste? Hop on to Carvana.com to get a real offer for your car in seconds. All you have to do is enter your license plate, answer a few quick questions, and if you accept the offer, Carvana will pay you as soon as you hand the keys over. They even offer same-day pickup in many cities. Save your time, score some cash, and sell your car the convenient way to
Carvana.
Pickup times vary. Fees may apply.
Hey everyone, welcome to the 500th episode of our Civil War podcast. I'm Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello, y'all. Thanks for tuning into the podcast.
So, 500 episodes.
Can you believe it?
No. If you would have told me back in October 2012 that we'd still be doing this podcast in August 2025, I wouldn't have believed you.
But here we are.
500 episodes, plus over 160 members episodes, plus the bonus episodes we used to do back in the day when we were begging for 5-star reviews on Apple. That's a whole lot of Civil War.
We've had some of you asking if we planned on doing anything special for episode number 500.
And we thought about doing 500 things you didn't know about Rich and Tracy. But, come on. No, not really.
But we thought we would point out that since starting the podcast, we've each had 3 different jobs, and we've also moved 3 times.
Although all those moves have been here in Colorado, moving around the suburbs northwest of Denver. Speaking of which, several years ago, we went through the Marshall Fire here. After we were ordered to evacuate, we went to Tracy's mom's, and that night, we didn't know if we'd have a home to go back to. And I thought about all that we might lose, but mostly, I was thinking about all these hundreds of Civil War books.
Thankfully, our home was safe, though. Then something else we went through, like all of you, was COVID, which for a while turned everyone's world upside down.
We lost my grandma during COVID and an uncle, and we lost Tracy's dad to COVID complications.
It's kind of amazing to think about all the ways our lives have changed since starting the podcast.
But our marriage has survived. Although sometimes, while recording an episode that's required a frustrating number of takes to get done, it's been even odds whether we would stay married. Back in the early years of the podcast, we'd kill ourselves to get an episode written and recorded and out to you guys every week. But as time has gone on, we've learned to cut ourselves some slack and show ourselves some grace. And sometimes when it's just not happening or there's something else that we have going on, we just leave it for next week. And I think that's been a pretty healthy thing to do as the years have gone on.
But we're still just as committed to seeing the podcast through to the end as we were back in those early days.
We are, definitely, and we're going to do it because we still think it's an important story that's worth telling, and we're going to do it for us and for you all, too. For us, because, the podcast has become a part of our lives, a part of our marriage over the past almost 13 years.
And we want to do it for all of you, whether you've been with us from the beginning or have just discovered the show recently. We appreciate the fact that we aren't alone on this journey, but that we're on it with all of you who listen to the podcast.
Yeah, over the years since we've started the podcast, a lot has changed with us, whether it's jobs or where we live or the folks we've lost along the way. But something that hasn't changed is, well, that we're still us and you guys are still you. We sit here at our dining room table recording each show, and then it goes out around the world to each one of you who listens to it. And we're grateful for each of you.
We appreciate the support and encouragement you've given us over the years. Just by listening to the podcast, we appreciate how you've led us into your lives. And then when you share your stories with us, it means a lot to us.
Yeah, so here with episode number 500, we really just wanted to say thank you for being on this journey with us as we continue to tell the story of the Civil War and Reconstruction, one episode at a time.
As y'all will recall, when we left off last time, it was June 2nd, 1864, and with the close of the Second Battle of Bethesda Church, Robert E. Lee had lost his third bid in 4 days to wrest the initiative from Ulysses S. Grant.
Even though Jubal Early's Confederates had surprised Ambrose Burnside's Federals, Old Jube found he lacked the numbers to turn the enemy's position, and consequently, the Yankees' flank bent but didn't break, and Early's attack eventually ran out of steam.
If Early's attack had succeeded, it would have got Grant's attention and forced him to react to Lee's moves. But its failure meant that Ulysses S. Grant was free to continue pursuing his own strategy, which practically everyone on both sides could guess meant a renewed Federal attack the next morning at Cold Harbor.
And so Robert E. Lee made the Cold Harbor sector as strong as he could. 2 divisions of A.P. Hill's Corps went there, as did John C. Breckinridge's understrength division that had come from the Shenandoah Valley.
During the afternoon on June 2nd, the Federals made a half-hearted stab to capture Turkey Hill, which rose up from the Chickahominy River bottoms and commanded the right flank of the Confederate line. Rebel troops were supposed to have already occupied the hill, but through an oversight had not.
Lee sent 2 divisions under Breckinridge and Cadmus Wilcox to clear out the Federals from Winfield Scott Hancock's Second Corps, who were working their way up the eastern slope of the hill. Around 6 p.m., they did so in a brief, furious fight that cost both sides several hundred casualties.
With Turkey Hill secured, Robert E. Lee knew he had a good, solid defensive line with which to face the coming assault.
Well, to be precise, he had a good foundation for a solid line, since in some spots, perhaps many, the exact Confederate position wasn't established until after dark, when troops could move and work in relative safety under cover of night.
Before the sun went down, rebel officers and engineers examined the terrain immediately in front of their current lines, looking for ground with the best possible fields of fire.
Then, after the sun went down, they established the new lines. In most sectors, that meant the engineers set a length of rope in the trenches, marked at intervals with white cloth. Picked men held the rope, and every 100 feet or so stood an engineer officer. A new position had previously been selected by estimation or triangulation, and now, at a signal, the officers and men advanced, holding the rope, with a precise number of steps until the rope marked out the new defensive line.
Once at the new spot, the engineers made final adjustments, and then working parties came up with picks and shovels and began to dig.
The ravine that had given Clingman's Confederates such trouble the previous day was now held by Evander Law's brigade. Law was one of the most experienced Confederate officers, and when he took his first look at the position he was expected to hold, bent back sharply at almost a right angle, in open ground and, in Law's words, quote, ill-adapted to resist an attack, well, he concluded that if the Yankees attacked this spot, they'd break through.
Accordingly, Evander Law decided the best solution was to construct a new line across the base of the angle, sacrificing a few square yards to the enemy in exchange for a shorter line and a better field of fire. And so, at nightfall, he set out with an armful of stakes, and, assisted by members of his staff, he personally laid out the revised position.
After the sun went down, scenes like that were repeated all along the Confederate line, as rebel infantrymen and artillerists labored to create the deadliest killing fields they could devise. 600 to 1,000 yards across the way, their counterparts in blue could tell what the rebels were up to, and the Federal soldiers knew all too clearly what was likely to happen in the morning. One of Grant's staff officers, Horace Porter, recalled a scene that was poignant or chilling, depending on one's point of view. Quote, as I came near one of the regiments which was making preparations for the next morning's assault, I noticed that many of the soldiers had taken off their coats and seemed to be engaged in sewing up tears in them. This exhibition of tailoring seemed rather peculiar at such a moment, but upon closer examination, it was found that the men were calmly writing their names and home addresses on slips of paper and pinning them on the backs of their coats so that their dead bodies might be recognized upon the field and their fate made known to their families at home.
Most Federals shared that same fatalism. At Meade's headquarters, Theodore Lyman heard no great hopes for a successful assault, since the rebels had enjoyed a full day and a half in which to perfect their defenses. Artillery officer Frank Wilkeson later noted that, quote, the whole army seemed to be greatly depressed the night before the Battle of Cold Harbor.
Early that evening, a steady rain began to fall. It continued most of the night, turning the ground to mud and exacerbating the misery of the soldiers. Toward morning, the rain petered out, leaving behind a gray, patchy fog that clung to low spots in the landscape.
Federal infantrymen stood too in their sodden rifle pits, while artillerists manned their guns. Orderlies took the horses of colonels and generals and led them to the rear. To be mounted on this battlefield would be suicidal, so the officers would go forward on foot.
At 4:30 on the morning of Friday, June 3rd, a courier rode up to the 10th Massachusetts Battery in Hancock sector. A moment later, its right-hand gun fired, a single boom shattering the still, heavy air to signal that the attack was on. For 10 minutes or so, the Union artillery hurled shot and shell at the Confederates, who were hidden among the earthworks across the way. Then word came that the Federal infantry were going forward, and the thundering batteries ceased firing.
As the Federal infantrymen started their advance, the heads of Confederate soldiers popped up on their works, and they poured forth a storm of musketry while blasts of canister from the rebel cannon tore into the Yankee ranks.
What followed was the worst half hour the Army of the Potomac experienced in its 4-year existence. Not only had the Confederates been given a day and a half to improve their positions, but the Union line bulged slightly outward in the direction of the rebel lines, so that as 2nd, 6th, and 18th Corps advanced, their paths actually diverged, and they were therefore exposed to crossfires from the concave Confederate line.
Even worse, the Union High Command made no effort to coordinate the assault. Meade's headquarters simply established a set time when everyone in the different formations was to go forward.
Baldy Smith fumed that such a plan, quote, is denounced by the standard writers on the art of war and belongs to the first period in history after man had ceased to fight in unorganized masses. Giving up the few advantages belonging to the assailants, it increases largely the chances of successful defense, and would never be adopted by a trained general.
Nor did the Federal Corps commanders do much better. Hancock apparently didn't coordinate his attack with Wright's 6th Corps, while Wright, approached by 18th Corps Commander Baldy Smith concerning his own plans, simply responded that he would, quote, unquote, pitch in at the appointed hour. Unable to interest Wright in a coordinated assault, Smith accepted the reality that he was on his own.
Winfield Scott Hancock went forward at 20 minutes till 5. He had 2 divisions making the attack, Francis Barlow on the left, John Gibbon on the right, each attacking on a 2-brigade front with 2 brigades following in immediate support. Hancock's 3rd Division, under David Birney, stayed back in reserve.
Barlow struck John C. Breckinridge's understrength division of Confederates south of the Gaines Mill Road, where the rebels' entrenchments were near the crest of an extensive ridge.
By sheer chance, Barlow's 2 lead brigades, under Nelson Miles and John Brooke, hit a particularly weakly held portion of the Confederate line. You see, the overnight rain had turned the rebel trenches in this sector into rivers of mud, so George Edgar, colonel of the 26th Virginia Battalion, took misplaced pity on his men and let everyone except a strong picket line leave the flooded trenches and sleep uphill where the drainage was better. As a result, when the Federals of Miles and Brooks brigades hit this portion of the Confederate line, there was a brief, violent clash, but the few rebel defenders were rapidly overwhelmed.
The Yankees plunged onward and opened fire on the startled Virginians who were just emerging from their bedrolls. Some were shot while still under their blankets. The hapless Colonel Edgar tried to form up his men, but was shot dead. Miles' Federals seized 125 prisoners, most from Edgar's battalion, who at least had a few hours' sleep to sustain them as they marched off into captivity.
Brooks' brigade captured 300 more Confederates. The Yankees also seized 8 artillery pieces. Like the charge at the Muleshoe 3 weeks before, Barlow had achieved a stunning initial success, and here he also found he was just as unable to capitalize on it. John Gibbon's division didn't come up on his right, since Gibbon was delayed by a brigade commander who, incredibly, failed even to awaken his men that morning, much less deploy them. That meant Gibbon was a full quarter of an hour behind Barlow in reaching the Confederate works.
Barlow had his other 2 brigades coming up in direct support, but the rebels, fully aroused by now, were pouring musket and artillery fire into them. One Federal soldier wrote, quote, "It had the fury of the wilderness musketry, with the thunders of the Gettysburg artillery superadded. It was simply terrific."
The Confederates now did as they nearly always did in such situations. They counterattacked, without taking into account the enemy's strength or their own. And here, the sight of the rebels pounding forward with leveled bayonets froze the Federals in their tracks. The fear was especially acute among Brooks' leftmost regiment, the sizable but inexperienced 7th New York Heavy Artillery Regiment. One of its members later wrote, quote, "What was to be done? In this dilemma, each man decided that question for himself. Green soldiers though we were, our short experience had taught us to know just when to run, and run we did, I assure you."
First to fall upon Barlow's Yankees was the 2nd Maryland, which recaptured the recently lost artillery pieces and shoved the Federals back down the slope. Moments later, a small Florida brigade came up and sealed the breach permanently.
50 yards below the rebel entrenchments, Barlow's Federals found a patch of dead ground that gave them some cover from rebel fire. Unable to advance, unwilling to retreat, they just hung on there, gouging the dirt with their tin cups or bayonets, anything to carve out shallow rifle pits. Their organization, already thrown into disarray by the swift advance, breach of the enemy line, and their repulse, was further frayed when one of the brigade commanders, John Brooke, was badly wounded by canister, and the officer who replaced him was killed almost immediately.
Worse, only one of Barlow's 2 follow-up brigades ever arrived in support. Through some mix-up, the others stayed behind. Birney's reserve division didn't come up either.
On Barlow's right, Gibbon's division did come up, belatedly, but never made it to the rebel earthworks. Instead, Gibbon's lead brigades found their line of advance blocked by a swamp, whose existence came as a surprise to everyone. One brigade skirted it to the right, the other to the left, and they charged forward, taking heavy losses, especially among officers, as they scrambled to reach higher ground. But most of the Federals never got within 100 yards of the Confederate works up on the ridge.
All in all, Hancock's corps suffered nearly 3,000 casualties in less than an hour. A soldier in Gibbon's division no doubt summed up the feelings of many when he admitted, "We felt it was murder, not war." This episode of the podcast is sponsored by the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War.
Are you looking for a deeper connection to history and want to make an impact in your community? Well, the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War is a charitable, fraternal organization dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the heroes who fought to save the Union and end slavery.
With values of fraternity, charity, and loyalty, from powerful bonds of brotherhood to rich traditions and rituals, the SUVCW offers its members the opportunity to participate in meaningful relationships and advance important causes, and are encouraged to be involved in community leadership.
The Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War accepts both descendants of veterans and non-descendants. To learn more, visit suvcw.org, or you can email join@suvcw.org.
The views, information, or opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War.
Getting ready to step into your career era? Set yourself apart with Adobe Creative Cloud Pro for students. Hone your skills with apps like Photoshop, Illustrator, Premiere Pro, and more, powered with the latest in creative AI. Students save over 55% so you can build a portfolio you're proud of. Launch your future with Adobe Creative Cloud Pro for students. Visit adobe.com/students to learn more.
Horatio Wright's 6th Corps, immediately to the north of Hancock's 2nd Corps, never got seriously underway. Wright also had 2 divisions up front to lead the attack under David Russell and James Ricketts, but Wright was acutely conscious that his 6th Corps occupied the center of the convex Union line and was thus the most exposed to Confederate crossfires.
An advance immediately at 4:30 that morning would have exposed the flanks of Wright's attacking divisions, so Russell, on the left, decided not to press his attack and waited instead for Gibbon's 2nd Corps Division to come up next to him and provide him with some flank security.
However, the sight of Gibbon's troops being cut to ribbons caused Russell to suspend his own attack, and one of his brigades, Emory Upton's, never entered the fight at all. On the right, Ricketts' division did press forward, but got nowhere. Ricketts said, quote, "We never even reached the enemy's works. We advanced under a murderous fire in our front from the enemy's artillery and sharpshooters, and when in range of their main line of battle, were simply slaughtered."
Paradoxically, the heavy enemy fire may have actually saved 6th Corps from taking severe losses, since it quickly convinced Wright to call off the assault.
To the right of 6th Corps, north of the Gaines Mill Road, 18th Corps jumped off promptly at 4:30. Like Hancock and Wright, Baldy Smith also had 2 divisions, under Martindale and Brooks, up front to lead the attack, but unlike the other corps, Smith had no supporting division to act as a reserve. That's because Smith's 3rd Division, Devon's, was strung out trying to hold the extended front that had been assigned to 18th Corps. Even then, there was a 2-mile gap separating 18th Corps from Warren's 5th Corps, its neighbor to the north.
The absence of a reserve to support Smith's frontline divisions proved not to matter in the least, though, since 18th Corps achieved no success at all, but not for lack of trying.
Baldy Smith had identified 2 ravines to his front that offered at least partial protection from enemy fire, and he tried to funnel his troops in the ravine's direction. Martindale's division on the right went in first. Like Upton in his charge on May 10th, here the Federal soldiers also advanced with fixed bayonets and uncapped muskets to discourage the men from stopping to fire before they reached the rebel works. But despite these tactics and the effort to use the terrain to advantage, nothing whatever could prevent them from taking a frightful pounding at the hands of the defenders.
Brooks' division on the left was so badly exposed to enfilading fire that Smith ordered him to suspend his attack pending assistance from 6th Corps. However, Martindale's division continued its assault, and the carnage was horrifying.
A captain in the 12th New Hampshire wrote, quote, "To give description of this terrible charge is simply impossible, and few who were in the ranks of the 12th will ever feel like attempting it. To those exposed to the full force and fury of that dreadful storm of lead and iron that met the charging column, it seemed more like a volcanic eruption than a battle, and was just about as destructive. The men went down in rows, just as they had marched in the ranks, and so many at a time that many in the rear thought they were lying down."
To a Massachusetts soldier in reserve, the division in front of him, quote, seemed to melt away like snow falling on warm ground.
Like Hancock's men, Smith's didn't retreat to their starting point when the charge failed, but rather halted where they could find cover and there began to dig in. A staff officer regarded this as evidence of the troops' quote-unquote staunchness. A more likely explanation, though, is that it reflected their realization that their path to the rear was just as drenched in fire and just as deadly as the way forward.
Farther to the Federal right, Gouverneur K. Warren's 5th Corps and Burnside's 9th Corps kicked off their own attack around 6 a.m., 90 minutes after the time set by Army headquarters, though it made no difference, since during that hour and a half, no Confederates redeployed on their front or needed to.
Burnside, on the Army's extreme right, made the principal assault here, supported by 2 brigades from Warren's Corps. That slim contribution from Warren was explained by the fact he felt his line was stretched too thin to commit more men to the attack. In any case, Burnside succeeded in driving in the enemy pickets screening the Confederate Army's left flank, but then concluded he couldn't tackle the rebels' main line without bringing up more artillery, and so he suspended the assault until that could be done.
For his part, on the morning of June 3rd, George Meade spent the early hours of the attack at Wright's 6th Corps headquarters in a farmhouse northeast of Cold Harbor. The first word he got of the assault's progress came from Hancock, who reported Barlow's breaching of the enemy line.
Though within minutes this was followed by news that Barlow had been forced to fall back, that initial encouraging report gave Meade a positive picture of the battle that colored his thinking for several hours. To him, Barlow's success, though fleeting, nevertheless demonstrated the basic soundness of the Federals' plan. Meade was convinced the Federals were stretched thin, their lines did have weak points, and a determined general assault by the Federals would surely shatter the enemy's position.
And so, at 6 a.m., when Hancock reported that his assault had stalled and reminded Meade, quote, that if the first dash in an assault fails, other attempts are not apt to succeed better, end quote, Meade nonetheless told Hancock that he was to continue to press the attack and throw in his reserves.
A report from Wright seemed to indicate that 6th Corps was making some progress, and though at first Meade heard nothing from Baldy Smith, he believed 18th Corps also was advancing. So at 7 a.m., when Meade sent a message to Grant, he relayed his positive impression of the assault so far, but also asked if these attacks didn't at first succeed, should they be continued? Well, Grant replied with advice that, in effect, left the issue in Meade's hands. Quote, the moment it becomes certain that an assault cannot succeed, suspend the offensive. But when one does succeed, push it vigorously, and if necessary, put in troops at the successful point from wherever they can be taken.
Meade's inclination was to keep pressing the assault. To a message from Hancock that indicated the 2nd Corps commander thought it would be a good idea to call off the attack, Meade replied, quote, no orders have been sent to you suspending or rescinding the original order to attack. I desire every effort be made to carry the enemy's works. Of course, if this is deemed impracticable after trial, then the attack should be suspended, but the responsibility for this must be on your judgment.
That message was time-stamped 7:40 a.m. Then, before 8, Meade got a wire from Wright saying that 6th Corps was ahead of its neighbors on either side, and that he thought he could carry the rebel works to his front, but he wouldn't be able to exploit his success without help on his flanks, particularly from 18th Corps. Seizing upon Wright's belief that he could carry the enemy works to his front, at 8 a.m., Meade sent messages to Hancock, Baldy Smith, and Wright, urging all 3 Corps commanders on the southern sector of the battlefield to press home their attacks.
About 30 minutes later, Meade received word from Hancock that he considered 2nd Corps' assault to have failed, quote, unquote, long since, but he indicated a willingness to attack again if 6th Corps and 18th Corps to his right experienced any success.
Meade shot back that Wright, quote, thinks he can carry the enemy's main line if he is supported by attacks of the 2nd and 18th Corps. It is of the greatest importance no effort should be spared to succeed. Wright and Smith are both going to try again, and unless you consider it hopeless, I would like you to do the same.
Hancock replied more or less that he did consider it hopeless. He told Meade, quote, an assault can be promptly repeated if desired, but division commanders do not speak encouragingly of the prospect of success since the original attacks failed. Unless success has been gained at other points, I do not advise persistence here.
In other words, if Meade ordered him to renew the attack, Hancock would do so. But if Meade wasn't going to order him to do so, then Hancock would use the discretion Meade had given him and decline.
The instructions that Horatio Wright and Baldy Smith received bestowed no such discretion, so even though their situation was just as bleak as Hancock's, they had no choice but to renew the attack. However, Baldy Smith, who was horrified by the slaughter, flatly refused, while Wright conveyed orders to his division commanders that allowed them to, quote, unquote, attack simply by increasing the fire from their current positions.
After the battle, a story spread that the Army of the Potomac refused direct orders to assault the Confederate works. In 1866, William Swinton, a newspaper correspondent who accompanied the Army, wrote, some hours after the failure of the first assault, General Meade sent instructions to each corps commander to renew the attack, without reference to the troops on his right or left. The order was issued through these officers to their subordinate commanders, and from them descended through the proper channels. But no man stirred, and the immobile lines pronounced a verdict, silent yet emphatic, against further slaughter.
Some of the federal troops undoubtedly believed they were disobeying in order to attack, but if the episode was a mutiny, as Swinton and others suggested, then it was a mutiny in which practically everyone participated except George Meade.
Even Ulysses S. Grant seemed to grasp the reality of the situation. A bit later in the morning, one of his staff officers, Cyrus Comstock, was snooping around in Baldy Smith's sector. He went down the line, observing the federal troops and the enemy's position, then pronounced himself satisfied at the state of affairs and went away.
Another aide, Horace Porter, reported that an hour before noon, Grant mounted his horse and, over the next 90 minutes, collected the views, directly or through his staff, of every corps commander, from Hancock, Wright, and Smith on the left to Warren and Burnside on the right.
Porter summed up the findings by recalling that, quote, Hancock now reported that the position in his front could not be taken. Wright said that a lodgment might be made in his front, but that nothing would be gained by it unless Hancock and Smith were to advance at the same time. Smith thought he might be able to carry the works before him, but was not confident. Burnside believed that he could break the enemy's line in his front, but Warren on his left did not agree in this opinion.
Convinced that further attacks would be futile, at 12:30, Grant sent a message to Meade saying, "The opinion of the corps commanders not being confident of success in case an assault is ordered, you may direct suspension of further advance for the present."
For all practical purposes, Grant's 12:30 order to Meade ended the third and final battle of Cold Harbor. An hour later, a circular went out from Meade's headquarters announcing the suspension of all further offensive operations, telling the corps commanders to entrench the positions they currently held, and asking them to investigate the prospects for cracking the enemy line, quote, by regular approaches, end quote. That is, by using the tactics and constructions associated with a siege.
At 2:00 that afternoon, Meade summed things up in his daily message to Henry Halleck in Washington. Quote, "We assaulted at 4:30 this morning, driving the enemy within his entrenchments at all points, but without gaining any decisive advantage. Our troops now occupy a position close to the enemy and are entrenching. Our loss was not severe, nor do I suppose the enemy have lost heavily."
But Meade was mistaken, because the federal losses were indeed severe, as Grant was soon to discover and perhaps already suspected. In later years, a myth would circulate that the Army of the Potomac lost 10,000 killed, wounded, and missing in 20 minutes. A number sometimes modified to 7,000 men in a half hour. Actually, the figures are wrong, but not by much. An exact number can't be determined since the Army of the Potomac only recorded casualties for the entire period it spent at Cold Harbor, which was June 1st through 15th. However, most estimates agree that the Army lost a total of 7,000 men on June 3rd, the majority of these in the first hour of the attack that morning.
The Confederates, by contrast, suffered fewer than 1,500 casualties in all, and of these, up to 2/3 occurred on the Confederate left, opposite Burnside. Incredibly, scarcely 500 were killed or wounded in the sectors where the main Federal attacks occurred.
At his headquarters near Gaines' Mill, Robert E. Lee got the first news of the battle about an hour and a half after it began. That was when A.P. Hill simply showed a courier the blue-coated bodies lying in heaps and said, Tell General Lee it is the same all along my front."
Around 11 a.m., a delegation from Richmond showed up at Lee's headquarters, headed by John H. Reagan, the Confederacy's Postmaster General. The fighting at Cold Harbor to the east was still going on, and Reagan, wanting to show off, remarked that the artillery fire seemed heavier than usual.
"True enough," Lee replied, "but it didn't matter much." He waved his hand to indicate the ceaseless musketry that sounded to Reagan like the tearing of some gigantic sheet. "It is that," Lee explained, "that kills men."
Reagan inquired what reserve Lee had if Yankees broke his line. This was a sore subject with Lee, who had begged Richmond for reinforcements, and he became animated as he replied, "Not a regiment, and that has been my condition ever since the fighting commenced."
Lee continued, "If I shorten my lines to provide a reserve, he will turn me. If I weaken my lines to provide a reserve, he will break them." Well, Lee's logic was sound and explained why, having just won what would prove to be his last great victory in the field, he had no ability to launch a counterstroke, though across the way Meade warned his corps commanders to prepare for just such a contingency.
However, the length of his line, slim Confederate numbers, and the Yankees' own formidable defensive powers all prevented Lee from launching a counterattack at Cold Harbor, although federal reports assert that during the afternoon and evening, the rebels launched local attacks, vainly trying to dislodge them from their advanced positions.
So, for the most part, the two armies simply settled down, improved their earthworks, and let night come. The Federal wounded, though, lay between the lines in agony, and for 3 days the wounded lay there, with neither side asking for a truce until June 5th, when Grant suggested in a letter to Lee that, quote, "When no battle is raging, either party be authorized to send to any point between the pickets or skirmish lines unarmed men bearing litters to pick up their dead or wounded without being fired upon by the other party."
Lee objected, pointing out that such an arrangement would lead to confusion. Better, he said, to handle matters through a regular flag of truce.
Next day, Grant responded by saying that he would order unarmed men bearing litters to go between the lines while carrying white flags. But Lee objected again, saying that such an arrangement was not the same as a regular flag of truce. Meanwhile, the lives of the wounded ebbed away, and the stench of the dead grew suffocating. Things went on like this until the evening of June 7th, when the two commanders finally reached an agreement. By then, though, more than 4 days after the last major Federal attack, nearly all the wounded had been smuggled to safety under cover of darkness by their comrades, or, more usually, had perished. One of the Federals who went out between the lines on the 7th said, "Every corpse I saw was black as coal. It was not possible to remove them. They were buried where they fell. I saw no live man lying on this ground. The wounded must have suffered horribly before death relieved them."
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation. And our recommendation this time is a magazine, North and South Magazine, Volume 5, Issue 2.
That issue from back in 2002 has an excellent article titled Cold Harbor, Anatomy of a Battle, and it includes a great set of maps.
You can find a list with all of our book recommendations if you head over to the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org.
Also at the website, you can find info on joining the Strawfoot Brigade and supporting the podcast in that way, just like Daryl K., Benjamin, Jesus H., and Tony N. have all done recently. A big thank you to them, and also to Spiritwood Music for their kind permission to use their song Midnight on the Water as the music you hear at the beginning and at the end of every episode.
And thanks to all of you for listening to this episode. Rich and I do hope that you join us again next time when we wrap up the Overland campaign. But until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.